This is episode 497 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Mark Abramson. He is the owner of Los Ranchos Gun Shop. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk, as given your ownership of a gun store, about gun issues and the Second Amendment and a lot of different aspects of that, including a new organization that you and I guess other gun store owners across New Mexico are involved in getting off the ground here in reaction to some of the anti-gun legislation that has been up in Santa Fe. But before we get into some of that, just tell us about your gun store and you, and kind of where you got involved in owning this store.
Certainly. It's an interesting story. We started the shop, we bought the shop in January of 2015. Prior to that time, I was a gun enthusiast and a firearms instructor, working a lot with youth, teaching them safe use of firearms. It was after we moved to New Mexico, my wife and I, in 2014, that I started having an interest in owning a gun shop, found one that was available for sale, started negotiations. Negotiations took over a year, as they sometimes do. But we had an opportunity to take an existing store and rebuild it. And we're pretty excited to do that. We've built a really good team around us.
So where's your store located? And if people want to buy a gun from you, how do they get in touch? That's the most softball question you'll ever get.
Okay, no problem. We're at 6621 4th Street in Los Ranchos de Albuquerque. It is the former location of WEX, which was BIP's or JB's. It's had a number of iterations since the 70s. So we occasionally still get people coming in looking for papas. We don't serve it.
Yeah, my daughter, when we were driving by on 4th Street this week, and she said, "Well, a WEX to a gun store, that's quite a transition." I said, well, yeah, that's
a logical transition, we think. But more importantly, our other building was falling down around us. And if you've driven by the location at Osuna and 4th, it has been leveled, and they're building a hotel and mixed use for residences and businesses. And frankly, from a business perspective, we think that development is going to be a really positive attribute in the valley and for Los Ranchos. That's my plug for the village.
There you go. All right. Well, so let's talk about guns in the New Mexico legislature, the Second Amendment, and as a gun store owner, you are primarily involved in buying and selling and running your business, but you had to follow what was going on in Santa Fe and talk about the current, or at least this last legislative situation. Because you probably felt a little helpless at times trying to keep track of what was going on and all the anti-gun measures. But maybe I'm wrong, but you tell me, were you able to get up to Santa Fe? Were you able to testify on some of these bills? How did that work out? And that kind of leads us obviously into the second part of our question, but talk about this past session.
This past session was really unique in that the number of gun bills and the gun bills that directly impacted the ability of gun shops to operate in this state really came to light. In prior legislative sessions, we've seen attacks on individual rights, which is always a problem, and one that many of us have gone up and testified about, mostly as gun owners, not in the industry. This time they actually were going after the industry. And hard.
Yeah, and that obviously changes the dynamic. Were you able to get up to Santa Fe. Were you able to testify virtually, which is one of the few silver linings of COVID-19? How did that work in kind of the practical application this time around during the 60-day session?
We had a number of gun shop owners who volunteered to go up during significant portions of the legislative session to talk to legislators, to talk to committees, and to press flesh. What we found was that our voice was heard, not necessarily by the movers, the authors of the various legislation, or even the members of the committee, but more common sense Democrats and Republicans who would listen and took it to heart. And those bills largely died this legislative session, with the exception of Benny's Law, which dealt with parents allowing a child to take a gun to school.
So given that results, what would you kind of analyze our 60-day session as? Overall, were you happy enough with the outcome, all things considered? Were you still disappointed in the outcome? Give us your analysis.
From a legislative standpoint, I think it was a wonderful outcome. We saw the lobbyists for the National Rifle Association, lobbyists that were there from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, were extremely helpful. I think even more importantly, the number of gun owners and gun shop owners that were there who made their voice known. I would chalk it up as a win. The problem is it presages some really bad things coming in the 30-day session. The governor is at least reported as being furious with the legislature's inability to pass meaningful gun reform.
Yeah, she's already stated that she's going to, the governor, that is, push the so-called assault weapons ban. But I suspect it's not going to end with that, although she is going to have to balance, different priorities. A 30-day session is not a long period of time. She's not calling for a special session, so far as I know, and the fact that she's already talking about putting that on the agenda for the 30-day session implies strongly to me that she's not looking towards a special session. So, given that particular piece of legislation, do you have any ideas what other bills might make their way onto the agenda?
I think we're going to see bills regarding delays in being able to transfer a firearm. There may be restrictions on 18 to 20-year-olds who are, last time I checked, legal adults, but making them unable to buy whether any firearm or semi-automatic firearm, whether they're going to be restricted in their ability to have a handgun, where in New Mexico currently a 19-year-old can be in possession of a handgun but can't purchase one. We may see those younger adults being assaulted, even while the governor wants to give 16-year-olds the vote. I can't figure that one out. We're also seeing probably some aggregate delays in she favored, but there was a proposed 14-day waiting period.
You think that'll come back?
I think it'll come back with a vengeance. It's the most restrictive in the country, and it may not be 14. It could be 10. Right now, it's 10 days for 18 to 20-year-olds anyway, under federal law, based on a change that was adopted last year. So,
isn't Hawaii at 14? So join them or something like that?
Correct, but it's impossible to buy a firearm in Hawaii anyway. So,
why is that? Why is that, if I may ask?
It's it's interesting. There's just not a firearm tradition in that state, and it's always been the most restrictive in the country. So you're correct. It's a 14-day there as well. Most states that have delays are anywhere from 3 to 7 to 10. So we're not sure what magic 14 has. I know there's talk about suicide prevention, and we need to find meaningful ways to stop suicide and murder-suicide. But we have to remember that someone who wants to injure themselves is probably laying out a plan to do that. And we need to enable law enforcement and families and the the mental health community in being awake to whether it's red flag or some modification of red flag. There's just too many people who have a gun who choose to use it in a way to injure themselves because they're going through something that they found a permanent solution, which is not, healthy.
Yeah. So, given the amount of attention that gun bills always tend to achieve, but the shift in Democratic politics in New Mexico, and this is I'm sure you've seen the shift from the Richardson era of being endorsed by the NRA and Democrats tending to also be pro-gun in the state of New Mexico, but also this shift has happened across the country where the Democratic Party now, at least publicly, seems to be united, broadly speaking, against guns. But then when push comes to shove, this legislative session, for example, here in New Mexico, there wasn't nearly the amount of actual passed legislation that we might have expected given the rhetoric out of Santa Fe. How do you see that? I know a lot of New Mexicans across the state own guns, even Democrats. So what do you see kind of on the ground?
We think that there is a New Mexico solution that includes Republicans and Democrats, and that can get worked out. The challenge is that
What do you mean by that? The next New Mexico solution?
The challenge is that we're seeing more and more outside influence. The movers are not the local chapter of Moms Demand Action. Rather, it's Giffords.
An anti-gun group, was it Bloomberg?
Bloomberg, which is the national umbrella for one group, and then Gabby Giffords' organization, which is now just called Giffords, and others. The diocese, or the archdiocese, actually stuck its nose in this time, which is really weird. But we're not sure why, other than maybe alignment of other interests. But we don't see it going away. But we see that the movers are coming from Santa Fe, Albuquerque, progressives, and even down in Las Cruces. But statewide, a Democrat in Deming has no interest in supporting this kind of move. So we're seeing it's really in the big three cities that seems to be driving it, and their influence comes from out of state, not in state.
Yeah. So you see this as another urban-rural conflict, broadly speaking, in New Mexico.
I believe so.
Okay. Well, that's not a surprise. And the Democrats, I guess, as they move toward the progressive, have moved towards more strong support for urban areas. But again, when it comes to the rhetoric versus the results, they haven't gotten nearly the amount of gun control that this governor would want. You think it's just rural Democrats kind of publicly, privately? How are they making their opposition known?
I think it's privately. I mean, the Republicans, because they are such a small minority, can be outvoted on everything. The rural Democrats, however, have to wake up to the fact that their neighbors, both Democrat and Republican, are gun owners, are freedom-loving, are not looking for these kind of solutions. If you live in Rama and you have to go to whether it's Gallup or Albuquerque to purchase a gun, and now you're told, okay, no problem, but now you got to come back 2 weeks later. That's a real problem. It's off-putting when some of our people do travel 2 and 3 hours to get to a shop in Las Cruces or here. uh, to buy their provisions, which would include firearms and ammunition.
Now, the NRA is often seen as being, this massive, powerful interest group, and it's amusing to me, coming from the more economic-oriented area of the conservative movement. We, for years, although less so nowadays, but for years we were always penned as the Koch brothers, just the puppets of the Koch brothers. The NRA is often seen by folks who want to have massive gun control as being behind all of the pro-gun support in this country. What is the NRA's role as you see it? And do you work with them? They really are, as far as I can tell, the only serious gun rights organization in New Mexico, but they're not. The myth is that they're some kind of hanging out in this big fancy office with 50 people working for them. I know the folks working for the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, which is the local equivalent of the NRA, and they're not a high-rolling organization by any stretch of the imagination.
No, the NRA provides through the NRA ILA, which is their political arm, one person who spends the 60 days during this legislative session, 30 days next year. She just moves into Santa Fe and lives there. She's been doing that for a number of years and pretty effectively has built relationships with legislators and information providers throughout the state. But she's one person. This year, for the first time, we saw the National Shooting Sports Foundation, lobbyist assigned to New Mexico, spend serious time here. Again, it's because the industry was more involved and threatened than it had been in the past. And they had two lobbyists at different times here on important pieces. That's the extent of that arm. The Giffords people had someone here full time. The Bloomberg people had people. The Moms Demand Action t-shirt crowd was there rallying. They would have a rally at the steps of the Roundhouse. They would sit in legislative sessions. They're very well organized. They meet throughout the year, and they have relationships built. But it's the Bloomberg money primarily that has, I don't want to say bought and paid because I think that's an overstatement, but has invested heavily in our legislature and has a lot of influence as a result of that. The bills we've seen that were probably the most, I'll call it obnoxious, were direct from the Bloomberg playbook that has been introduced in other states. They're sharing that information and trying to impose that, which would fix problems that they can't even tell us are broken.
Yeah, and just to make it clear, two lobbyists during a legislative session in New Mexico for an entire industry or movement is not a huge number. I mean, I know from dealing with issues in this session, the liquor industry, alcohol sellers had at least 10, maybe 20 lobbyists for different groups within that industry. So it's a very big difference there.
Yes, and as you alluded to earlier, the fact that the legislature meets through committees during the year is really important, and it tells us that the 30-day session is not the time to start thinking about this. It's really now.
Yeah. Okay, so that leads us to your involvement in a new interest group that you are going to be working with that is going to work on behalf of gun store owners and trying to take their specific issues into what they trying to achieve in Santa Fe. So talk about the name of this group and where you see that going and your involvement in it?
Sure. The New Mexico Firearms Industry Association is really in formation. The articles of incorporation are sitting in the Secretary of State's office, sitting on somebody's desk. Hopefully that gets processed in the next few days. The association really came about because some movers, which tend to be some really fiercely independent gun shop owners who realize that we can't do it alone. So locally, BMC Tactical, the Right to Bear Arms, Calibers, Omni Arms, ourselves got together, and a few others. I shouldn't say it was just us, but and others from around the state started talking with the NRA, with NSSF, and we really need to start making sure that our interests are known and protected. We don't mean to duplicate the work of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, which is representing primarily gun owners in the state, the NRA, which represents gun ownership issues, working more with the industry, the National Shooting Sports Foundation. But whether we do it through a lobbyist, whether we help fund a lobbyist with NSSF, that we're very much in formation right now. My involvement is I happen to be in the room, and I don't know if my hand was raised or it was raised, but so I am now president of this association.
You were voluntold in some way, shape, or form.
But everyone in the room accepted some role and responsibility to everyone's credit. So we're going to work together, gun shops, to see if there are ways we can communicate better with each other, more effectively. If somebody wants to testify down in Roswell, we want to create opportunities for them to do that without having to come up. Zoom is certainly a vehicle, but we want to speak with as much as we can with one voice and looking for positive solutions to deal with the real underlying issues here and not these made up ones. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's kind of how the legislature is dealing with everything right now.
And you alluded to it, but if you could kind of elaborate a little bit on how your efforts may be complementary or different from those of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. You're specifically concerned because there have been those legislative proposals. You're trying to address things that are specifically targeting your industry, gun stores.
Yes. Currently, the only real legislative dictate on gun shops is on private transfers, where they have to go, the individuals who want to transfer a firearm privately have to go to a dealer and have that transfer completed. The legislation or the bill that became law limits a shop to charging no more than $35. The problem is our legislature is apt to do that. $35 will probably still be $35 in 50 years because they won't look at it again. So the question is, are we really subject to that $35 cap? Now, some places are charging 15 or 20, but we know that there are shops that are charging $50 or $75 because they just don't want to do it. Is that legal or not? Is it a crime or not? I'm not sure. But the big issue came up with the unfair trade practices law, which has really been a sleeper for all businesses in the state. It's a small amount of money if you're ever caught engaging in an unfair trade practice. And Senator Cervantes wanted to update that by making the fine more significant, but then singling out the firearms industry for a cap of $250,000 per violation, which is crippling. And I'm sure you know that it takes 2 pages, and you don't even need a lawyer to file a complaint um, in this state, and it could put the industry on the ropes very quickly with frivolous claims.
Yeah. Now, one of the bills that I looked at, and again, Rio Grande Foundation supportive of the Second Amendment, but very complicated and a lot different from the economy and education issues. Constitutional liberty is definitely something we support, and it falls under that. Just you really need specialists and specialized people to address those Second Amendment issues. But the liability uh, challenge, and I don't remember what the bill number was. Maybe you can enlighten us on that. That's one of those issues that definitely has additional crossover by targeting a particular business for additional liability, and we saw this in the medical malpractice issue, at least relating to that, a very different group that was being targeted. But New Mexico is known as kind of a judicial hellhole for being pro plaintiff and making it very hard for businesses to operate here, whether that's doctors or gun sellers. Can you talk about that legislation in particular and that angle and why it's so problematic for your industry?
Sure. Well, on its face, it seems innocuous enough because it's talking about how you're advertising. If you advertise a gun as new and it's like new but not new, is that an unfair trade practice? Do you have an opportunity to correct that? I mean, all of that seems common sense. I mean, if a used car was sold as new, you can imagine, or if the dealer had rolled back, remember those days when people rolled back the odometer? Um, that's a false representation and a fraud, which may have a lot of other consequences. But in the firearms industry, where you're buying an item that is for its intended purpose, or you're buying a device that may be unlawful, uh, that you buy knowing it's unlawful, but then can turn around and say they sold an unlawful item or an item that was unlawful in New Mexico. Um, there are all kinds of companies out there that try to get around the National Firearms Act by selling suppressors, but calling them something else, and having them imported into the state. Well, we think that that's already a felony under federal law, and to put a civil penalty doesn't add anything. The real challenge is that someone who is a stranger to a transaction could actually file a claim under the Unfair Trade Practices Act, or multiple claims, as happened in the pawn industry. That just cripples the industry. And if you put a $250,000 bounty on each of those claims, uh, it would put most of us out of business on the first claim because insurance doesn't cover that.
Yeah, and it's a sneaky and different way to attack the business associated with gun selling in the state of New Mexico. How much of a priority do you think that is relative to the other ways that the anti-gun groups are pushing to kind of hinder the industry in the state? And what are the bigger threats? What are the bigger things that you see maybe as not going to be effective that they're pushing?
The plaintiff's bar has been looking for an avenue to get around the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms and Armaments, or Ammunition Act, which gives, they misrepresent it, but it gives protection to the firearms industry that says if that device works the way it's intended to, that the firearms industry is protected. And you may recall that 20 years ago, it was very common for cities to file actions against firearms manufacturers because that firearm or a group of firearms may have been used in criminal enterprise in their city. And they were spurious then, and legislation was adopted, led by John Dingell from Detroit area, Democrat, to protect the industry from those kind of specious lawsuits. This, one of the exceptions, and it came about after the Sandy Hook nightmare, that Bushmaster, which manufactured the gun that the murderer used after he killed his mother, had advertised that gun as a tactical, cool, weapon, and they tried to argue that that was somehow, they tried to argue that it was because it was marketing, it was an exception to the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which was an interesting argument. And when Remington, which owned Bushmaster at the time, filed for bankruptcy, the insurance company settled that case. So there was never a finding whether that was an exception. But states have been looking for an exception, and an unfair trade practice would be an exception to that, much like it would if a gun was manufactured and was defective. People can still sue successfully, and have, if a gun it has a bad manufacturing process and someone's injured as a result.
Right. Well, there's always the trial attorneys are always looking for ways to help pad their own bottom lines, and as we said before, whether it's the medical providers or gun industry, they're definitely going to look for those opportunities. Now, kind of stepping back, and there's obviously been, as is always the case, controversies about guns, whether here in New Mexico or more currently nationally. And I do have to kind of ask you about the broader issues and the politics of guns at this point. And you see whether it's incidents in Chicago and other urban areas, or then the Nashville school shooting. There are these incidents, and I kind of want you to give you an opportunity to defend your industry and defend guns from the attacks that they have faced, and that they are somehow the problem in American society, and it's not something else. So, what's your approach to defending selling these weapons?
Well, it's interesting because when you think about school shootings, and as horrible, it's really nightmarish to think about that. But in a school shooting situation, since Columbine, I heard the statistic the other day, you would think thousands of kids have been killed. And the number is under 200. Now, it's still too many. But there are hundreds of millions, maybe it's probably, there's over a third of the country owns guns or is in possession of guns. And when you think about the number of crimes that are committed with guns, the number of people killed with guns, and if you exclude suicide, we're still talking about, even with suicides, you're talking about half the number of people that are killed every year by fentanyl. But we're looking for a solution where, if there's 500 million guns out there, where is who's talking for the fact that of the 500 million guns, there are, fewer than 15,000 guns that are used to kill someone in a year. Still too many. I'm not making light of that. Our job is in the firearms industry is to make sure that a law-abiding citizen is purchasing that gun. There's a process we go through. We work with the FBI every day to go through that process. Most people are proceeded immediately, which means they have nothing in their background that raised a question. Some are delayed, either statutorily or because the FBI wants a little additional time to do that. They generally do that within 3 days. And that process goes smoothly. When we look at the number of guns that are used in crimes, where are they coming from? They are not coming from gun stores in this state. They're coming from people's cars where they're being stored improperly. They're coming from people's homes where the home is being robbed and they steal guns. Occasionally, very occasionally, it could be at gunpoint. Someone may lend a gun, the gun is then lost or stolen. That's where these guns are coming from. So most of the guns used in crimes are coming from a black market, not from the lawful commerce in firearms. How you stop a mass shooter, generally, if we're dealing with people who are mentally unwell, I know everyone talks about mental health, and the fact is it's a really intractable problem. But people who are getting counseling where the counselor determines that they are a danger to themselves or others should have an obligation to say something, and they don't, rarely do. When a family member is legitimately concerned that someone's having dissociative moments or having some psychotic episode, they want to do something, they don't know what to do, they may feel threatened about doing anything. There are steps people can take right now. I don't like the red flag law. I think there's a violation of due process, but it's there, and that has to be used.
Are there instances where you've had somebody trying to buy a gun that you kind of thought that they might be mentally unstable, and you maybe reacted to that and either didn't sell them or delayed them, or what kind of freedom do you have as a gun store owner to kind of make sure to the best extent possible that your product doesn't wind up in the hands of somebody who's prone to do something with it?
Sure. Well, as a business owner, we are authorized both in practice and in law to deny a sale to anyone. We can't do it because of a discriminatory reason,
Right, like race.
but like race or ethnicity, religion.
Right.
But beyond that, we have great latitude. If someone appears to be intoxicated, we will not sell a gun. We can't. Because even if they marked that they're not habitually addicted or a user of an unlawful substance or alcohol, if we make that determination, we don't. The biggest risk we face as retailers is in what we call a straw purchase, which is where somebody's buying a gun, but we think it's for somebody else. Somebody comes in, eyes the gun, handles the gun, looks at the gun, and then whether 10 minutes later or a day later, somebody comes in and just says, I want this gun, doesn't touch it, doesn't look at it, just says, I want this gun, and pays for it. That is a flag for us that it's a straw purchase. And our association, the National Association, does a lot of training on how to identify straw purchases. They can be really bad at it, the customer, or some of them can be really good at it. The other thing we're seeing is that people in New Mexico who may have dual residences are buying guns in New Mexico and then transporting them to California to resell them at a profit. That's a problem. Whether it's a straw purchase or they're setting themselves up as a dealer because they're not buying the gun for themselves, they're buying it for a profit, which means they have to be licensed. And we're seeing more and more enforcement on those kinds of issues as well. The ATF, which gets a bad rap by a lot of the interest groups, the gun interest groups. I mean, the fact is they're working every day to make sure that the retailers are in compliance with federal law, and we work with them, as do the other legitimate gun shop owners in the state. We work with them every day to make sure that we're in line with what we're required to do to keep our community safe. We live in this community. We own businesses in this community. We want our community to thrive.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Last question for you before we wrap up. You mentioned the new, and I want, if you have the name of the organization that you're kind of working under with the other gun store owners. I'm not sure I caught that, but if you have a website or anything, provide that. But real quickly, as you do that, obviously, a lot of the challenges we face in New Mexico are due to the politicians we elect. It's one thing to lobby them once they get into office, but it's another thing to have more pro-gun politicians of either party elected in office. So is that going to be a component of what your organization is doing? So talk about the organization, any website or any information you have or are going to have, and then that question.
Sure. We do not have a website currently. We're waiting for our documents, and then we have to file with the IRS to get our tax exemption. But it'll be the New Mexico Firearms Industry Association, and a couple of us who are also lawyers are volunteering to get that legwork done for the association. But we'll be meeting actually next Tuesday to get some of our organizational things secured. But do I see us lobbying? Certainly as businesses within the state, whether we hire a lobbyist or develop a means by which to make sure we get to legislators, that's likely. As far as affecting elections, I'm not sure we're looking at creating a political action committee, for example. That we're in formation, and we'll take those fights on as they come about. But we really want to be a statewide association for those in the industry, whether you're a brick and mortar store or you want to be an auxiliary member. If you're in the industry, we're looking for support wherever we can, because we see this fight continuing. And the 30-day session, we'll see how much money they have to spend. They were spending like drunk sailors this time.
Stop insulting drunk sailors.
Understood. But they couldn't have spent any more money, to the point where even the governor said, I'm not sure this is responsible.
Yeah, well, then she vetoed the tax cuts.
Right, and signed everything else. So, it's we just want to be very proactive throughout the year. When our legislators live in our community, it's easier to talk to them than it is while they're getting beat up working for their little per diem up during a legislative session. So that is something we want to do. We want to speak with one voice, but each our own individual voices as we do that. We're not trying to be a monolith where one person's speaking for the entire association all the time.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark Abramson, Los Ranchos Gun Shop. Appreciate your time today. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell your Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.